UFC facts and stats you may not know, part 3. I've done 2 of these so far and you guys seem to love them, so we're back with part 3. In this video, I'm going to be talking about current UFC fighters, past UFC fighters, and even some UFC records and random facts and stats you may or may not know, and I'm willing to bet that not a single person that watches this video knows every single fact in this video, and if you do know all of them, let me know in the comments. Also, if you guys want me to continue this series, then do me a favor and drop a like on the video. I always appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's get right into it, starting off with Nico Price, who has some pretty interesting stats about himself. He just fought Jacoby Smith in the most recent UFC card, but Nico Price is actually the only fighter in UFC history to have 2 KOs from bottom position, which is actually crazy when you think about it. A KO from bottom position is already extremely rare. Like, that almost never happens. How often do we see that? And the fact that this guy has 2 of them and he happens to be one of the slowest fighters that we have ever seen, it's actually quite impressive that he's been able to muster up 2 bottom position KOs, one against Randy Brown, hammer fisted him until he KO'd him against the fence, and against James Vick where he threw an up kick and KO'd him. So yeah, Nico Price, despite not being the best fighter, does have 2 KOs from bottom position. And he also happens to be the biggest underdog in UFC history whenever he recently fought Jacoby Smith. That's right, he was a 12-1 underdog. I don't know how he ended up being that big of an underdog. It's not like Jacoby Smith is some Dagestani monster that was going to steamroll Price, even though he did win. But I thought the odds were a bit ridiculous. But yeah, he was a plus 1,200. I think Jacoby Smith was like a negative 2,500, something insane. So yeah, Nico Price also has the honors of being the biggest underdog in UFC history. Next up, he actually has the honor of being Robbie Lawler's fastest finish in Robbie Lawler's entire UFC career. That's right, Robbie Lawler, I think at 41 years old, finished Nico Price in 38 seconds in his retirement fight. This was such a nice KO by Robbie Lawler that people were talking about how it was fixed and that Nico Price took a dive to make Robbie Lawler go out on a high, which is insane. I thought it was a clean KO. But yeah, Robbie Lawler got his fastest finish in the last fight of his career against Nico Price. A lot of people don't know that. People forget, man. And last but not least, this man has 7 children. That's right. His pullout game is weak. Nico Price has 7 kids. Him and his wife stay pumping and dumping. You know what I'm saying? I'm joking. But yeah, he has 7 children, so I'm surprised this guy's not fighting more often. That's a lot of mouths to feed. So Nico Price, we want to see your next fight booked soon, my guy. And yeah, those are some fun facts and stats about Nico Price. Let's get on to the soldier of God, Yoel Romero. He just signed with BKFC at 48 years old. This guy's literally going to kill someone inside the BKFC cage. Either way, Yoel Romero did not make his UFC debut until he was 35 years old in 2013. And people wonder why this guy was fighting for titles at 40 years old, 42 years old. It's because this guy was a late bloomer. Yoel Romero came into the MMA, I think he didn't debut until he was like 31, 32 years old, and then he made it into the UFC at 35. Obviously, he's an Olympic freestyle wrestler, but you would never guess that when watching his fights because he rarely wrestles. Either way, this guy made his UFC debut at 35 years old, which is crazy because most guys make their UFC debut. Well, I know Alex Pereira made his UFC debut at 34, but most guys make their UFC debut when they're like 26, 27, 35 years old is actually crazy. And the amount of success he was able to have after 35 and how scary he was is actually quite impressive. Yoel Romero is also one of the only fighters, if not the only fighter, I could be wrong on this, in UFC history to get a title shot coming off of 2 losses. That's right, he was on a 2-fight losing streak whenever he was given a title shot against Israel Adesanya at UFC 243, I believe. But yeah, Yoel Romero, 2-fight losing streak. Israel Adesanya said he wanted Yoel Romero, and the UFC gave him his wish. Now, granted, those 2 fights that Yoel Romero had lost were very, very close. Like, they could have, I won't say they could have went either way, but they were close losses. He didn't get dominated, but it is still insane work, in my opinion, to give a guy a title shot coming off of 2 losses. But nonetheless, a 42-year-old Yoel Romero lays claim to a title shot off of 2 losses. And last but not least, people don't know this, he won a $27 million lawsuit against a company named Gold Star for a tainted supplement that he ingested and actually failed a UFC drug test and was suspended. And he sued the company because obviously people already look at this guy as a completely jacked like lab experiment, and then he tests positive for what people think is steroids, and people are like, oh, well, duh, it's Yoel Romero. But turns out it was a tainted supplement, and he sued the company for that tainted supplement, and he won $27 million. Now, obviously, he had to pay his lawyers a lot of money. I don't know how much of this money he actually got to see, but that is crazy to sue a company and win $27 million. That's actually crazy. So those are some fun facts about the Soldier of God, Yoel Romero. Getting on to the former UFC bantamweight champion, Juliana Pena. That's right. You see her in the thumbnail. We got some pretty funny stuff and interesting facts about Juliana Pena, but starting off pretty simple. She's actually the first mom to ever become a UFC champion. Juliana Pena in 2017 became a parent. She became a mom, and all the way in 2021 being the biggest underdog in WMMA history against Amanda Nunes, pulls off the upset, submits Amanda Nunes, takes her title to become the first UFC champion. That is also the first UFC champion to be a mom. Also, there's rumors that Juliana Pena fought pregnant because she originally didn't know she was pregnant when she fought. I don't know if that's true, so I didn't put it on the screen, but somebody in the comments let me know if that is true or not. Next up, she's also the first female fighter ever to win the Ultimate Fighter. Season 18, I think back in 2014, Juliana Pena becomes the first female fighter in UFC history to win the Ultimate Fighter. The first 17 seasons had all male winners, and I don't think there's been an Ultimate Fighter female winner since. I don't think it's ever happened again. So she might be the first and the only Ultimate Fighter to be a female. So there's that stat for you. And before I show you the last one, I'm going to give you two more fun facts, or one more fun fact about Juliana Pena. She was actually submitted by Valentina Shevchenko and by Germaine de Randamie, who are known to be like pretty predominant strikers in the UFC, and she was submitted by, the fact that Juliana Pena was submitted by Germaine de Randamie is actually kind of funny. And yeah, so there's another fun fact. And last but not least, you saw it in the thumbnail. That's right, Juliana Pena got starched by a 9-to-5 male worker in an alley. She messed around and found out why women shouldn't fight men. She found a 9-to-5 random guy off the street and was talking noise, and he threw a 1-2 down the pipe and showed her why women can't compete with men. And yeah, that's what happened. She even admitted in an interview herself that women shouldn't fight men because it's an unfair advantage. And the fact that she, a UFC champion, was able to get worked by a random guy on the street just goes to show you that it's not that women can't defend themselves. It's just that men have more testosterone, more bone density. They're stronger naturally, bigger naturally. So yeah, that's why men and women should never compete against each other. Just so you know, take it from Juliana Pena, a professional in this aspect of the MMA world. Let's get on to the next one. Daniel Cheeseburger Cormier. We have some pretty good facts about DC. Daniel Cormier has a win over every fighter he's ever faced except for Jon Jones. That's right, he has 2 losses to Stipe, but let's not forget that Daniel Cormier actually knocked out Stipe in their first fight and then dropped 2 fights in a row against him. But outside of outside of Jon Jones, Daniel Cormier has defeated every single fighter he's ever faced. The only fighters he couldn't defeat in his entire career were Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic, just showing how much of a legend and how much of a GOAT DC is. A double champion, and this guy only lost to the consensus heavyweight GOAT and the consensus light heavyweight GOAT. So yeah, this guy is made of GOAT stuff. He's also the first fighter to ever defend titles in 2 different weight classes. I believe that him and Amanda Nunes are the only 2 fighters to achieve this feat, even though it's more legitimized with DC, being that he was a light heavyweight and heavyweight champion, whereas Amanda Nunes defended as a featherweight champion, which the women's featherweight division is absolutely a joke. It never really existed. Either way, Daniel Cormier won the light heavyweight belt against Rumble Johnson. He then defended it against Volkan Oezdemir. Then he went up to heavyweight, won his second title against Stipe Miocic. Then he defended it against Derek Lewis. I don't care what you think about DC and the level of competition he faced. Going and winning a title in one weight class, defending it, then going up, winning a title in a second weight class, and then defending it no matter who it's against, that is extremely impressive. And that's why he is the only male champion to ever do so. And he might be the only guy that ever does that, because double champions are going to become more rare, especially simultaneous ones, as the UFC are making these guys vacate their belts. So I thought that was an absolutely amazing fact about DC. Next up, he actually has a win over Anderson Silva. A lot of people don't know this, but Anderson Silva stepped up on 1 day's notice to fight Daniel Cormier at UFC 200 whenever Jon Jones tested positive for steroids. They had to call somebody. They called up the Spider, Anderson Silva. They said, hey, man, Jon Jones pop for dick pills again. We need you to step in. Anderson Silva steps up on a day's notice, actually hurts DC to the body, so DC resorted to grappling and won a pretty snooze fest decision over Anderson Silva. But nonetheless, a lot of people do not know that he has a win over Anderson Silva, or even that they ever fought. So there is that for you. And last but not least, regarding DC, he actually, like Yoel Romero, he didn't debut in MMA until he was past 30 years old, which is crazy. DC, obviously also an Olympic wrestler. What's up with these Olympic wrestlers debuting late? I think Henry Cejudo didn't debut until later on as well, which is why he's like 38 now. Either way, DC made his MMA debut when he was 30, which is why whenever he was finally fighting John Jones for a UFC title, he was like 36, 37 years old. Just showing that the longevity, even with age that this guy had and the stuff he was able to accomplish in his late 30s is extremely impressive. Put some respect on Daniel Cheeseburger Cormier's name. Although he's not the best commentator, he is one of the best fighters. And that's some facts about Daniel Cormier. Let's get on to Darren the Gorilla Till. Now, Darren Till obviously had a rough end to his UFC career, but let's talk some facts. And this is not a good one. Darren Till got his title shot against Tyron Woodley, I think at UFC 221, 229, something like that. Either way, he might be the only fighter in UFC history to land 0 significant strikes in a title fight. And the fight went to the second round. That's right. Tyron Woodley beat Darren Till so bad and submitted him in the second round that Darren Till did not land a single significant strike on Tyron Woodley. He had 1 total strike landed. It wasn't counted as a significant strike. And then Tyron Woodley went on to take him down, elbow his head through the octagon, and then submit him via Darce. So yeah, not a stat you want to hold to, but Darren Till might be the only fighter in UFC history to land 0 significant strikes in a title fight. Next up, he actually does speak fluent Portuguese. Living in Brazil for 3.5 years, Darren Till, I think he was getting in a lot of trouble in Liverpool at the time. He moved to Brazil, trained MMA for 3.5 years, had children with a Brazilian woman, and learned fluent Portuguese. And another fun fact about Darren Till is that actually in 2012, he was stabbed in the back multiple times and was able to survive the stab wound, which is extremely brave by him that he was able to get past that and survive and actually have a successful MMA career. So shout out to Darren Till for that. Also, Darren Till has never attempted a single submission in his entire MMA career. I know that might not come as a crazy surprise, being that he's primarily a striker. He's not a grappler. That's proven throughout his UFC fights with his terrible takedown defense. But yeah, I'm really not trying to dunk on Darren Till. These just happen to be the facts about him. He has never attempted a single submission in his entire MMA career. And Darren Till has actually proved Paddy Pimblett wrong. And what do I mean by that? Darren Till proved that Scousers actually do get knocked out, because Darren Till is a Scouser. He is from Liverpool, and he was KO'd stiff by Jorge Masvidal back in 2019. And it was a brutal one. And I kind of felt bad for Darren Till. I thought he was going to beat Masvidal, but no, Scousers do and can indeed get knocked out. And Darren Till found that out the hard way against Jorge Masvidal. There are some fun facts about the Gorilla Darren Till, who's now 2-0 in influencer boxing, by the way. So look out for his next boxing match. Next up, Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who fights this weekend. I'm rooting for him. I do think Gabriel Bonfim's going to beat him, but I am rooting for him. Let's start off with the fact that he is tied with Jan Blachowicz for being the oldest active ranked UFC fighter at 42 years old. That's right. Wonderboy, I believe, is ranked number 12 at welterweight. He's 1-4 in his last 5, but with all the work he put in the welterweight division, he's still ranked at 42 years old and looking for a win, obviously, against Gabriel Bonfim this weekend so he can remain in the rankings. But yeah, impressive that old heads like Stephen Thompson and Jan Blachowicz are able to stay in the rankings at a ripe age of 42 years old. And Wonderboy doesn't look 42, man. This guy takes care of himself. This guy is like the most healthy-looking 42-year-old I've ever seen. Let's get on to the next thing I want to talk about. And one of my viewers brought this up to me. Shout out to AMR Goated. If you're watching this, he brought it up that there's a potential conspiracy theory with the first title fight between Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. And people speculate that Stephen Thompson might have won that fight, but they had already announced the winner as Tyron Woodley, and it would have been way too controversial and too awkward to announce Woodley as the winner and say, hold up, it's actually Wonderboy that won the fight, so we're going to call it a majority draw and just book the rematch. That's a very interesting conspiracy theory. And hey, who knows, man? Maybe there's somebody that has some inside information on this, but it was kind of weird how Bruce Buffer read Tyron Woodley as the winner, and then they went back and Tyron Woodley was like, what the heck's going on? Maybe Wonderboy was the real winner on the scorecards, but it was already announced that Tyron Woodley was the winner. So instead of giving Wonderboy the win and making a really weird situation, they were like, we're just rebooked the fight. And that's what they did. And ultimately Woodley came out ahead. But yeah, that's a very interesting thing to think about. I'm not saying it's 100% true, but hey, man, crazier things have happened. And last but not least, he has only ever been submitted one time in his entire career, despite being a lifelong kickboxer. I think this is extremely impressive when you consider that Wonderboy, until he was 29 years old, was primarily a kickboxer. And this guy has only been submitted one time in his entire career. And that was very recently when he was like 40 years old against Shavkat Rakhmonov. So for 11 years in the UFC, despite fighting some of the best wrestlers at welterweight, Johnny Hendricks, Tyron Woodley, Bilal Muhammad, Gilbert Burns. This guy was never submitted until he fought Shavkat Rakhmonov. So I think that's extremely impressive. But unfortunately, I do think that Bonfim will likely get a submission win over him this weekend. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Wonderboy schools him on the feet and makes him look silly. But there are some fun facts about Stephen Thompson. Let's get on to Max Holloway. You guys already know I got to bring Max Holloway for every single one of these videos. And if you know, you know. Max Holloway has never fought a black guy. That's right. 30... How many total fights? I think he has 34 total fights in his MMA career. He's never fought a black guy professionally. And I think Volkanovski also has never fought a black guy. So these guys they have not fought some of the homies. And let me say, we got to make it happen before he retires. We need Max Holloway versus Bobby Green, right? We need that fight. Jerome versus King Green is the fight to make next. I'm joking. But yeah, he's never fought a black guy. That's a interesting fact about Max Holloway. He's actually second all-time for Octagon fight time, Max Holloway, 41 minutes away from taking the record. I think Rafael dos Anjos has 8 hours and 43 minutes of Octagon time total, whereas Max Holloway has like 8 hours and 2 minutes. So he's just shy. Like if he goes to decision two or three more times, Max Holloway will overtake Rafael dos Anjos for the most Octagon time in UFC history. However, if RDA comes back, obviously he would extend that record. But RDA is coming off a major injury versus Jeff Neal where he tore his ACL, and he's also 40 years old. So we could see Max Holloway overtake this record by the end of 2025. You never know. Very interesting stuff. Max Holloway also holds the latest KO in UFC history. He's actually tied with Yair Rodriguez. At UFC 300, Max Holloway KO'd Justin Gaethje in round 5 with 1 second to go. The only other fighter to achieve this is Yair Rodriguez versus the Korean Zombie, where he also got a KO with 1 second to go. And that's actually crazy. You actually can't break this record. It is the latest KO in UFC history, and it will always be the latest KO in UFC history. You can only tie it. And one of the most crazy moments on the biggest stages in UFC history, on UFC 300, he lands a buzzer beater, 1 second to go KO on Justin Gaethje. Actually, legendary stuff by Max Holloway. Next up, if he loses to Dustin Poirier, this is not such a fun fact. He will be the first fighter in UFC history to go 0-6 in trilogies. Yeah, that's right. He will be the first fighter to ever have 3 losses to 2 different fighters in his UFC career. So Max Holloway is fighting against some potential history against him to being the first fighter to go 0-6. And he's aware of this, as he's mentioned it in the buildup, as he doesn't want to be the first fighter to drop 3 fights to 2 separate fighters. So I hate that he has to fight Poirier in his last fight. I like both these guys. I do think Poirier is going to get it done. But as Max Holloway would say, we're going to find out Saturday night, brother, so tune in. Either way, that is some fun facts about Max Holloway. Let's get on to Jeremy Stephens, Lil Heathen. This is the last single fighter I have on this list with some facts. Jeremy Stephens actually has the most losses in UFC history. Obviously, I spelled history wrong. We're just going to ignore that. But Jeremy Stephens holds claim to the most losses in UFC history. Not a record you want to have, but he does hold it at 19 losses. And honestly, I don't think this is ever going to be broken, just for the simple fact that the UFC does not allow fighters to stay in the promotion as long as they did with as many losses as this guy would have. Not to mention, fighters just don't fight that many times anymore to get that many losses. So yes, I think Jeremy Stephens might hold this record forever, or unless like Jim Miller continues to fight and loses that many fights. I think Jim Miller might actually be 1 or 2 losses away from this, now that I think about it. So it is possible for Jim Miller to break this. Jim Miller might actually be tied with 19 losses. I'm not sure, but either way, I know Jeremy Stephens at the very least is tied for the most losses in UFC history at 19. Getting on to the next fact about Jeremy Stephens, he actually has 34 total UFC fights, and he has never been submitted in the UFC. That's actually extremely impressive. It's not like Jeremy Stephens has this otherworldly takedown defense, but obviously a very hard guy to submit. Pre-UFC, pre-2008, he was submitted 2 times before the UFC. In his UFC career across 34 fights, never been submitted, and he's fought a lot of great grapplers. So that's actually extremely impressive. I know he's a journeyman and he's not the best fighter, but there's something to be said about a guy who can never be submitted in 34 fights. That is very impressive, in my opinion. He actually KO'd Rafael dos Anjos when RDA was debuting. That's right, in 2008, RDA made his debut against Jeremy Stephens, and Jeremy Stephens put him out with one of the hardest and cleanest uppercuts you'll ever see. And a lot of people don't know that they fought. So people forget, man, Jeremy Stephens sent Rafael dos Anjos, who would go on to become a future lightweight champion, into the shadow realm like 17 years ago. That's actually crazy that was that long ago. And last but not least, Jeremy Stephens is the only fighter to knock out his opponent with a shove. I forgot which event this was at, but Jeremy Stephens was set to face Jakar Close at lightweight. It was around the synchronized sneezing era of the world in 2020, and Jeremy Stevens shoved Drakkar Klose at the weigh-ins, and Drakkar Klose actually got injured so bad from that shove, he had to pull out of the fight, and the entire fight was canceled. I don't know if Jeremy Stevens was ever fined, but that's actually insane. I don't think there's ever been another time where a fighter got shoved and had to have been pulled out of a fight because of it. So there are some fun facts about Lil Heathen Stevens. Next up, we got some UFC records you may not know, and after this, I'm going to go through some random facts and stats about completely random fighters at the end, not about one fighter. So let's get into some UFC records you may or may not know. We're just going to go through these real quick. Most UFC fights, Jim Miller has 46 UFC fights. That is the most. Most UFC wins, also Jim Miller has 27 UFC wins. Most finishes in UFC, Charles Oliveira has 20 finishes, which is actually crazy. I don't think that'll ever be broken. Most decision wins, Brad Tavares has 14, tied with Neil Magny actually. So Brad Tavares and Neil Magny are tied for the most decision wins in UFC history. Merab Dvalishvili is coming for that record, I'm telling you. Most title fight wins, John Jones with 16. Longest average fight time, this was recently overtaken by Valentina Shevchenko, 18 minutes and 44 seconds. Before that, the record was Joanna Jędrzejczyk, which is a little bit less. And actually, Israel Adesanya is like top 5, which just goes to show you how much of a decision merchant Israel Adesanya can be. Total fight time in UFC history, RDA, 8 minutes, 43 seconds, and 43 minutes and 19 seconds. Most knockdowns landed in UFC history, Donald Cerrone at 20 knockdowns, which is actually quite crazy. Donald Cerrone always throwing head kicks, knocking guys out. Most takedowns in UFC history, Merab Dvalishvili. And Merab passed GSP up for most takedowns in UFC history at 97. And actually, Merab Dvalishvili, I can guarantee it right now, after his next fight, he will be the first fighter ever to reach over 100 takedowns. And honestly, I don't think that'll ever be broken. Merab is named the machine for a reason. This guy will forever hold the most takedowns in UFC history. Fastest title fight KO, McGregor versus Aldo. Finished Jose Aldo in 13 seconds. I think that remains to be the fastest title fight finish in UFC history. And the fastest title fight submission, Ronda Rousey submitted Kat Zingano back in 2014 in a measly 14 seconds. I don't think we'll ever see another 14-second submission ever, much less in a title fight. So that's actually an insane record by Ronda Rousey. Whatever you might think of how delusional she is, she does hold some pretty gnarly records. And let's get on to the last slide where we're bringing up good old Chuck Liddell, the cartoon version. Let's talk about one fact about Chuck Liddell. He holds the record for the longest knockout win streak in UFC history, 7 KOs in a row. There's only been one other fighter to do it 6 times in a row, and that's the next fighter I'm going to mention. But yeah, Chuck Liddell has 7 knockout wins in a row and without losing, and that's the most in UFC history. And that's going to be very hard to beat. Knocking out 7 guys in a row whenever the competition is so stiff in the UFC, especially in today's age, is extremely hard. Right behind him, Sergey Pavlovich has the most consecutive first round. I spelled round wrong, Ralph. The most consecutive first round KOs at 6 he had. Before losing to Tom Aspinall, Sergey Pavlovich finished his last 6 opponents all by first round KO. And honestly, I don't think that's ever going to be beaten. Maybe I would say Tom Aspinall could beat it, but Tom Aspinall at this point is submitting and knocking out guys. So even he is not going to be getting 6 first round KOs in a row. So that's obviously extremely impressive. I know we don't look too highly of Pavlovich in 2025 just due to how bad he's fallen. But yeah, he does hold that record. Demetrius Johnson has the latest submission in UFC history, 4 minutes and 59 seconds of round 5. And he achieved that against Kyoji Horiguchi back, I think, in 2015, whenever he submitted him literally with 1 second to go. This is actually kind of crazy. Paul Craig actually holds this record in a 3-round fight where he submitted Ankalaev with 1 second to go. But yeah, Demetrius Johnson will forever hold the latest submission in UFC history with 1 second to go. That is actually insane. Tony Ferguson has the longest win streak in UFC history without an undisputed title shot at 12 wins in a row. Of course, he was scheduled to fight for the belt multiple times, but it fell through over and over and over. So a 12-fight win streak and never got an official title shot. Last but not least, speaking of Tony, Ferguson versus Khabib might be the most cursed fight. Not might be. It is the most cursed fight in UFC history. They were scheduled a total of 5 times and canceled all 5 times. I do not think there's ever been a fight that has been scheduled more times than Tony and Khabib and has not happened. That is actually insane. It got to the point where it literally got canceled by a world pandemic in 2020. And we were, as MMA fans, we're all like, yeah, this fight literally is never going to happen. It is legit cursed. And yeah, that's the 3rd installment of UFC Facts and Stats that you may or may not know. If you knew all of these, Drop a like. Let me know in the comments. Let me know some facts you guys know also in the comments. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. I'm out, and peace.